Anyway, I don't know, I've done several programs, and sometimes somebody will come up to me and say, how'd you happen to do that program? Because they're kind of eclectic, I would say, the things that I kind of get interested in. So, the program today on Dick and Jane, I was in a bookstore quite a few years ago, not a bookstore, actually an antique shop, and there were a whole bunch of books for sale, and one of them was this little book, and it was $5, and as I looked at it, I thought, I think I know what this is, and I went home, I bought the book and a couple of others, and it is the original book from 1930, the first Dick and Jane. Now, if you're gullible, you can buy this on eBay for hundreds and hundreds of dollars. Don't do it. So I think I got a good buy for $5. It's certainly not worth it. And so I kind of got into collecting, and of course I was a teacher and a principal, and I know we've got some former teachers here too, and grew up with Dick and Jane, and so I kind of got interested in it. So over the years, if a book has come along, I will purchase it, usually on eBay or something. If you're a real collector, you try to get the pristine copies and everything. Well, I'm not like that. Mine have got marks in them sometimes, and I try to get ones that aren't too awful, but I've got a pretty good collection from 1930 right up until 1965 that I'll tell you about. So that's kind of how I happen to do this program, which is kind of fun. So I'm not as, like, John kind of speaks off the cuff a lot better than I do, so I kind of have a script I usually go by so I don't stray too far, so hopefully you'll forgive me if I kind of seem to be reading, but all right. So, whatever happened to Dick and Jane? Go, Spot. Go and find Dick. Go and find Jane. Run, Spot, run.
I remember that.
The sentences were simple. The characters were generic. Dick, Jane, Sally, mother and father. The faces were that odd orange pink, once known as flesh tone, and the fences were always white. At times, Jane's hair shone with radioactive brilliance. Everyone was endlessly cheerful. Father went to work, mother wore high heels to clean, clean, clean. Jane watched Dick climb, while Dick climbed trees. She helped clean. The dramas were never larger than an upset flower pot, the adventures never greater than a bike ride down the street. Now, if I remember to flip the pictures, I'll be in. Oh, here we go. Do you remember this family? I'm looking around, quite a few probably do. Do you remember sitting in your first grade classroom learning to read from one of the Dick and Jane books?
Yeah, I do, yeah.
If you were 6 years old between 1930 and 1967 in the United States, there's a high likelihood that this text was the first of your school career. If you were 6 years old between 1967 and 1988, there's a good chance your school text was similar in the kind of words, but without Dick and Jane.
Oh.
Well, those of us who are a little older on the planet can just about mark our ages based on the Dick and Jane book, an edition that we learned to read from. Did you learn to read from with Sally, Dick and Jane?
Yeah.
You're probably a child of the 50s. That's my first grade picture. They're over there on the right. Can you see me? Haven't changed a bit, have I?
Serious one.
Yeah.
Did you learn to read with John, Jean, and Judy?
No. Didn't know that.
If you did, you probably went to a parochial school.
Oh. I wonder why that was.
Now, do you remember Mike, Pam, and Penny? Then you're probably a child of the 60s, because that is when African American children were introduced into the readers.
Oh.
Dick and Jane books, the predominant readers in public schools from the 1940s through the 1960s, were created by an educator named William S. Gray and a former teacher and reading consultant named Zerna Sharp. And they both believed that the whole word method was the ideal way to teach reading. But to understand the phenomenon of Dick and Jane, it's helpful to have a little background on learning to read and the books that preceded the series. In the early 19th century, schoolhouses were not well supplied with books of any kind, so students were asked to bring a book from home. Now, few families owned many books, so guess what the most common one was the children brought from home?
The Bible?
The Bible. So the very early one-room schoolhouses made it impossible for children to be separated by age or ability, so teachers did their best to provide students with the skills that could be used regardless of the book they had in front of them. And so for that reason, phonics, or the sounding out of words, was the preferred reading method because it could be applied by students reading at various levels. The first popular reading textbook was written by a man named William H. McGuffey. You've probably heard of the McGuffey readers.
Yeah.
He lived from 1800 to 1873. The first McGuffey reader was published as early as 1836. Now, McGuffey was born to Scottish parents in Pennsylvania, and they raised the McGuffey children to value education and religion. And by the age of 14, he was already traveling around from community to community as a teacher to get subscription scholars. In other words, students whose parents would pay for their education. So when he had the time and the money, he returned to attend classes at Washington College in Pennsylvania, and he became a professor at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. And while he was there, he was hired as a consultant to teach, to prepare a template for a reading primer that could be scaled for different reading levels. He created 4 levels of the reader, selecting short stories, poems, prayers, oratories, and religious stories for the textbooks. So in this way, children were exposed to a carefully organized but a varied selection of writing. But because of the variety of material, reading phonetically, sounding out the words, was important. Well, as times changed, so did the content. More immigrants came to the country. They brought with them a wider variety of religions, so the religious material wasn't appropriate any longer. But by 1879, the text was non-sectarian, but the stories offered good examples of family values and morality. Well, the McGuffey readers were the preferred textbook in the classroom for many years. They sold an estimated 122 million copies over almost 90 years, but by the late 1920s, theories behind teaching reading were changing. Education reformers such as John Dewey were urging reform of primary education. Dewey wrote that with all the massive social change, it was important to re-examine how reading was taught. So he advocated teaching children from experiences to which they could relate. While he didn't advocate for a specific way to teach reading, he was among those who set the stage for the coming changes. Now, William S. Gray was among those who led the way for a new way of teaching literacy. He had a PhD from the University of Chicago. He was dean of the College of Education, and he eventually was the chairperson of its teacher preparation committee. His strong background and his specialty in reading assessment made him very attractive to a publishing company named Scott Forsman. And the publisher was looking for an expert to create a reading curriculum for schools. Zerna Sharp was hired by educational publisher Scott Forsman and Company as a reading consultant. She was a former teacher from LaPorte, Indiana, and she had been a first grade teacher, and she had also been a principal. She approached education theorist William Gray with an idea that would change the face of American literacy. Now, while they came from 2 different educational backgrounds, they both observed that some students struggled with sounding out words. They were among the educators who became enamored with what we know as the whole word, or the look-say method of reading. So in other words, children are taught to recognize a whole word, such as house or down, a lot more easily than they could sound it out, and to look at a word as a whole unit. Also, in Sharp's view, young students had a hard time reading because they couldn't relate to the standard children's books. So she proposed a collection of short stories that would each introduce a handful of new words. They would start average kids that any elementary school child could identify with, and as a critical component, the characters would appear in simple illustrations designed to help connect a given word with its definition. Well, William Gray loved the concept, and with his philosophy, Gray and Sharp created the Dick and Jane stories. Now, under Gray's guidance, Sharp developed a core cast whom she named Dick, Jane, Baby, Mother, Father, and a well-behaved dog named Spot. She chose the character names that were easy to sound out, 4 letters, easy to recognize and sound out. Now, in the very earliest books, the characters were not fully developed. Siblings Dick and Jane's sister, Baby, eventually became
Sally.
Sally. She was first called Baby Sally, and then she became Sally. Their cat, Little Mew, eventually became good for you. Gold star. Now, the dog in the stories was always named Spot, but as you look, he was originally a terrier, and it was in the 1940s when the Cocker Spaniel became. I was going to ask you what it became. When the Cocker Spaniel became a more popular breed of dog, that Spot became a Cocker Spaniel, but he was originally a terrier. And there were others. There was Tim, who was the teddy bear Tim, and it's not pictured there. And of course, mother, father, grandmother, grandfather all appeared in some of the stories. Well, Dick and Jane originally appeared in 1930, and that was part of a pre-primer in a series of reading textbooks called the Allison Prereaders, published by Scott Forsman. Now, William Allison had been a textbook writer at Scott Forsman since 1909, and he combined with William Gray to form the Allison Prereaders. Now, interestingly enough, Zerna Sharp, who oversaw everything, and it was her idea, she never personally wrote any of the stories, and there was a method to writing them. She oversaw all that, and her name never appeared on any of the books that were ever written, and yet she's known as the mother of Dick and Jane. So she didn't personally write any of the dozen stories in the Dick and Jane collections, but she supervised the production, selected and edited the storylines, their plots, their illustrations. She was very personally invested in the stories she had created. And Sharp, who never married and never had children of her own, she always called Dick and Jane my children. Now here, we have the first Dick and Jane book that appeared in 1930.
That's the one you have?
I have them all. Yeah, they're up there. Yeah, I do. There was a revision in 1936. The only revision was it was called Dick and Jane. Looks very similar, but the inside was exactly the same. It just went from being the pre-primer to Dick and Jane. There was one book in 1934, which is, I guess it's considered very rare, but I don't think I paid too much for it. But sometimes if people don't know what they're selling, that's this was the only time that this book was ever published, was 1934, this little book. It was called More Dick and Jane Stories, and they didn't reprint that. It was just the one time. And you can see some of the illustrations down at the bottom. And by 1937, they had come up with the idea of a bigger book called Before We Read. And this was a pre-reader. It didn't have any words. It was mostly activities and pre-reading activities. And this became a staple right up through the 60s of the Before We Read books. Now, I think, the format, it sounds so simple, but the format that Zerna Sharp created was very highly structured. A first primer contained about 80 words, because Sharp believed children became overwhelmed by too many words, new words. So it was one new word was added only every third page. Every 3 pages, all 3 words would be used together. Look, look, look. No story would contain more than 5 or 6 words, so there was a lot of repetition. And that's why a typical page might read, "See Dick run, run, Dick, run." So along with a very limited vocabulary, colorful and clear illustrations demonstrated whatever the page was about, and that was key. Probably if anybody remembers anything about Dick and Jane, it's probably the illustrations that you think of. For example, if the word to be emphasized was up, the story might involve an illustration of Dick launching a toy airplane with Jane or Sally talking about it. See it go up, up, up it goes. So the whole successful idea of it was that the program was the fact that children, they were first led to interpret a picture story, had a simple beginning, middle, and end. It was based on suspense that elicited the reading of simple words such as oh, oh, or look, look, as normal responses to story action. In other words, the first words were also selected by Sharp after she listened to children's speech patterns and how her observations that children talked in 2 or 3 word sentences. How many young children today still use these same words, young children, to call attention to themselves or others as they engage in creative play? So here's a little, hopefully we've got this going. This is the 1930 book. Well, the readers were sold for classroom use, and they came with a page-by-page teacher's guide that listed the vocabulary for each textbook. And in the classroom, phonics drills of letter sounds were replaced by word flashcards. So a teacher could hold up cards with house, up, down, spot written out, and the children practiced recognizing the word. And there were big books and workbooks, and kind of became a really big thing. Actually, William Gray believed that by the time a child completed 2nd grade, students needed phonics to sound out more complex words. But in the leap to teaching this whole word, it's not clear that all school systems ever got the message about teaching phonics later. Gray also had a focus. He wanted to tie subject areas in health and science and social studies and arithmetic, each having their own series, which happened with the vocabulary mastered in the beginning to read of Dick and Jane, so that he thought that would improve readability in the same areas. And they all became part of the Curriculum Foundation series, which kind of dominated for the next 30 years, dominated the education market. And he also envisioned a series which going right up through 9th grade of these reading books, which it did. Now people always call these the Dick and Jane books, but Dick and Jane never appeared. They never got past the 2nd book in 1st grade. That's the only, after that there was no more Dick and Jane, even though people think of them as kind of like they're never mentioned after the 1st grade text. Well, one of the really most important things about all the Dick and Jane books was that the fact was their speech was never as colorful as the illustrations that captured their true personalities. And that's probably because the text was so dull. That's why the illustrations stand out in everybody's memory. Now, the very first books were, the illustrators were really wonderfully talented graphic artists, and through the years, and did many other things. The first books were illustrated probably by someone named Miriam Story Herford. But by the 1940s, and here's what this is from 1936, and you can see this is from one of the Prereaders, a bigger book. You can see how colorful, but what the illustrations look like. And these were updated every 2. But perhaps one of the most well-known illustrators was Eleanor Campbell. And she illustrated many children's books, along with Keith Ward. And she's all the books, a lot of the books through the 1940s and into the 50s. Now, she based her illustrations on photographs she took of her friends and relatives' children, and it was said that she pored over Sears catalogs and Montgomery Ward catalogs to put the family in clothing that was the latest fashion of the day. Especially in the beginning, her watercolors for the series were intended to show scenes as a child might see the world, including everyday activities such as when a preschooler gives their teddy bear a drink in the drinking fountain, or dressing up in your parents' clothes to help mother take the laundry down from the line. There were other illustrators, illustrations who followed Ruth Steed in the 1950s. It was Robert Childress in the late 50s, early 60s, and the last illustrator, Richard Wiley, and he was the illustrator who introduced the African American characters in the series. So you can see how everything is very, they became a little, I don't know what the word is, cherubic, they're, a little, very, very, that's actually very pretty, very pretty picture, but that's, yeah. Well, here we have the Curriculum Foundation series from the 1940s. So the books, states wanted books to be updated, and so every 10 years there was a major update, and every 5 years a revision. This is what the series looked like in the 1940s. First, second, and third grade were divided into 2 books, but again, Dick and Jane never appeared after Our New Friends, and then there was 1 book for the upper grades. And here's what most people remember, Dick and Jane. This is pretty much what they looked like pretty much in the 40s and into the 50s. Well, the world created for Dick and Jane was very bland, as mentioned. What was Dick and Jane's last name?
I have no idea.
They didn't have one. They lived in a suburban neighborhood. Their house had the white picket fence. Mother took care of the home. Father went to the office during the week, and he mowed the lawn on the weekends. Interestingly, intentionally to create a national audience, because these books were sold all over the world, all over the country, and to appeal to all regions of the country, the stories never had any indications of location. There might be some raindrops, but there was never weather. Usually was never night. Everything was, it was void of all of that. As I mentioned, every few years the state school boards requested stories to be updated, and with major and minor revisions. And when they did that, they changed, they did updates in clothing and house furnishings and automobiles, but they always stayed in that same pristine, well-organized neighborhood. So the creators felt that they had created a neighborhood which children could identify, which would become a problem later on. But the limited number of words just restricted any action in the, so as mentioned, Dick might send that airplane up in the air, but there wasn't any opportunity for any more excitement than that. That was it. But besides teaching reading, Dick and Jane set examples of positive contributions. They did their chores, they were helpful to other people, they were kind to each other, and if they laughed at baby Sally, it was always done in good fun. Here are the revisions to the Before We Read, the pre-readers. You can start to tell the pretty much the same inside, updates in the illustrations. And by 1941, they had come out with what we call 3 Preprimers. What do we have? We look and see, we work and play, we come and go. And they introduced words and go through the 3 of those at the beginning of I think it was the beginning of first grade, and then they updated in 1946. And then we have the introduction of Fun with Dick and Jane, the first grade textbook. This is the 1941 and 46 editions that most people remember. as wanting to read with Dick and Jane.
What's that?
It's
What's
in
that?
French, isn't it?
Oh, is that French?
Yeah.
Oh,
Mm-hmm.
okay.
Yeah. The popularity of and the domination of Scott Forsman and the Curriculum Foundation series spread throughout the country, and it spread worldwide. And so in addition to being published in 5 languages, there were a limited number of publishing companies that had permission to publish special versions through the years. So we have there were parochial Seventh-day Adventist editions. The parochial edition on the right, you'll see the cathedral, it was called the Cathedral Edition. Now early on, it was still Fun with Dick and Jane. Later on, they kind of changed the name to John, Jean, and Judy. And I don't know why, except I read somebody said, because it kind of went with Jesus, I don't know, I mean, but that's what they, and I've got an illustration of that. So there were also, there were French editions, that's probably French Canadian, it's probably Cathedral, it's probably Catholic parochial, but Samuse would be fun, fun, and that I found those I don't have that, I just found the picture of it. And there were British editions, and I've got called the Happy Trio, and there were Braille editions, and then I've got an example up there. There were phonetic experimental editions, which are just crazy. I happened to find one. Texas editions, Canadian editions. So, and of course we have. Do you remember Think and Do? You remember your Think and Do workbooks?
Yes.
Okay, those are the early ones in the 40s. And then this was the second first grade reader, Our New Friends, the 41 and 46. Now here's a little illustration of the book from the 1940s. If I could get everything to work. That's okay, there's supposed to be music with it. Just gives you some of the illustrations, what the level was by first grade. I had to cut out her reading and put some music because she read so slowly. This will kind of bring us to the 1950s. But as early as 1929, even when Dick and Jane were first introduced and this whole word method of reading, there were some experts who felt that it was going to cause problems for children. And one person, his name was Dr. Samuel Orden, he was a neuropathologist or something like that. He realized that there were children who could benefit, but he wrote a paper in 1929 where he described the whole word method as an obstacle for reading for most students. But that didn't slow down the pace of Dick and Jane. They were just, by the 1950s, over 80 to 85% of children in the country were learning to read with Dick and Jane. And so, there were other publishers that were inspired by the success of Dick and Jane, and they adopted a similar format. One that stands out is the Allison Jerry books. Some people learn to read with Allison, Jerry. It was usually a brother and a sister, and maybe a dog or something like that, But Dick and Jane, they were the market leaders until the early 60s, and with this whole word controlled vocabulary. And there continued to be the picture books without words, the Prereaders, there were Preprimers, the junior primer, which came if you were not quite ready for the first grade book. And they also had, Dick and Jane there was one book that taught hygiene and health called Good Times with Our Friends. In 1951, they introduced two, there seemed to be less and less in each book as time went on. They were I don't want to say watered down, because it couldn't be too much more watered down than they were, but they introduced We Read Pictures and We Read More Pictures before we read. In 1951, every revision of the book now had the name, had the new before the title of the book. So we have The New Before We Read, The New Fun with Dick and Jane. If you are a collector, you can tell which edition of some of the books. For the 1956 editions of the books have a little white dot on them. They really didn't change too much between 51 and 56. I thought that was kind of neat. That was a little from the logo paper on the from Perkins School. It's been an exciting week for all kindergarten children. They each received a book called We Read Pictures. It's enjoyable for the children to have a book of their own to use. Most of the children just look at some of the bright pictures in the book. Others started reading pictures. This was from March of 1955 at Perkins School. Now, for me, when I got into, just being interested in collecting and this kind of stuff, what hit me was one of these books. When I saw one of those books, that's what I remembered. I do remember in kindergarten, I remember that, probably the top book, I guess. I also remember I don't know if any of you do or not, but I remember that it was all like, connecting, matching things and circling the one that was different and all that kind of stuff. I do remember that I probably could have done the whole book sitting there. And I do remember it was 1 page a day. And I do remember being reprimanded by the teacher because I dared to turn the page ahead, because I thought, I was done. It was like, and then, so it's funny what you remember, what sticks in your mind at the age of 5, That's a close-up before we read. So. These are the updated versions of 51 and 56 of We Look and See, We Look and Play, We Come and Go. Are those 51 or 56? They're 56. See the little white dot?
Oh.
The new We Come. It would tell you which side, but no. Now I mentioned that these were published and different publishers had permission to publish them. You'll see that the one on the left is We Look and See. That was see where it says the Happy Reading Trio scheme? That was a British edition. This is what the Cathedral Basic Reader, this is what it looked like in the 50s. Here's an interesting page of, now what they would do with the Cathedral editions is they were the same as the other editions, except they would substitute a story here and there with a story that was more religiously oriented, morality. This one, Father said, "Come John, we want to go and hear Jesus is here." It goes on to say, the second page, Judy said, look, see Blessed Mother. Oh, see Blessed Mother. Red and blue and yellow. I see Blessed Mother. I see little baby Jesus. Father said, come Judy, Jesus is up here. So that was one of the stories that was substituted for one of the others, but many were just exactly the same. $1956, Work and Play. Gives you an idea of the illustrations. coonskin cap in 1955.
Oh.
You notice that it was the same simple words. Always, that didn't change much. In some of the revisions, they switched the words just a little bit.
Funny bit, that's what I thought.
Yeah.
Oh, ex-husband.
Well, of course, with every book, there was the Think and Do workbook that went with it. And this was the revision of Fun with Dick and Jane in 1951 and 1956. On the far left, that was the one that the Heather Trio reading scheme, and the Fun with John and Jean, just a couple of illustrations. I did find one book that I thought was quite interesting. They had an Amish edition of Dick and Jane in 1956, and very plain cover. But if you look at inside, it's all black and white. No color in the pictures, but it's the same text as near as I can see. I thought it was interesting, however, if you look at the last photo, the last picture, it's a car. And I thought that was interesting, but it was very plain.
Did they change the clothes to make them long?
I don't think so. And then the second grade, the first and second grade books were divided into two books for first and second grade. This was the second book. It was called Our New Friends. And you can see, interesting, this one on the Seventh-day Adventist edition. And then, so, kept everything the same. Well, by the 1950s, the tide was turning against this whole word approach. So a lot started to happen with learning to read. Now, there was an article in Life magazine in 1954, and there was an author named John Hershey, and he sought to answer the question of why do students bog down on the first R? And he noted that the books were dull. He said, how do you inspire children with insipid work content? And shortly after this Life article, Rudolph Flesch was an author and a reading consultant, and he wrote a book called Why Johnny Can't Read. And in the book, he condemned the whole word method. So these events were the underpinnings of the rise of Theodore Geisel. Anybody know who Theodore Geisel was?
Dr. Seuss.
There you go. As a former illustrator and advertising illustrator, his first book for children was published in 1937, and the first book he published was called And to Think That I Saw It on Mulberry Street. But with the press covering the dullness of children's literature, Houghton Mifflin and Random House asked him to take on a challenge. Could he write an engaging children's book using only 220 vocabulary words? Well, indeed he could. And the resulting book was The Cat in the Hat in 1957. Now, the book changed his career by making him a household name. He became known as Dr. Seuss. But it also changed the whole trajectory of children's literature. Children's books no longer had to be quote-unquote white bread stories devoid of imagination that moved at a glacial pace. Dr. Seuss's work helped erode the power of the look-say reading method that was so entrenched in the schools. He said later on that that was one of his real accomplishments, was that he helped kill Dick and Jane. Here are what some of the covers of what some of the books looked like going into the 1960s and 62 and 65. And we'll talk about the changes and what was happening, because there was, well, by the 1960s, Dick and Jane, as you can see, were a lot more grown up. They looked bigger, they looked older, and they were more sophisticated. Well, did you know that in her 40-year career, Jane had more than 200 different outfits? Her clothes were always still taken from the Sears or Montgomery Ward catalogs. And their world got bigger. They not only had stylish clothes, more stylish houses, they started playing basketball and watching TV. And they had barbecues on their new charcoal grill, and they played challenging games of ring toss. Now with Jane delighting in the fact that she had some real power over men by winning each time, putting her hands on her hips and laughing. Father bought a new car every 5 years, but Mother didn't get behind the wheel till 1962. But the children became more independent and worldly, but it wasn't enough to keep the books going, because white suburbia was losing its luster by the 1960s. Here we have in 1962, there was a major revision. We come and go, we look and see, we work and play. Those were all revised to become Sally, Dick and Jane, fun with our family, and fun wherever we are. So there were quite major revisions. And this is just a little short clip of this. And what you can see, and there was the illustrators were asked to create more action, and you can see that there's just more action, and if they're even if they're not doing something, I think with the sweeping marks and everything, still the same words. That didn't change. Well, we've moved beyond my era, but this is still kind of cute. The civil rights movement was in full swing in the early 1960s, and Brown versus the Board of Education in 1964 outlawed separate but equal, and President Lyndon Johnson brought a new view to the White House in 1963. Interestingly enough, and I didn't know this, Johnson had attended a teacher's college for higher education, and from 1928 to 1929 he taught. He stopped his studies because he couldn't afford to keep going to school. And so he taught Mexican-American children at a segregated Wellhausen school in Texas. But he found that gave him a lot more than a salary. He saw that most students could not even dream of college because they were too poor. And in remarks made at Southwest Texas State College in 1965, he said, quote, "I think it was then that I made up my mind that this nation could never rest while the door to knowledge remained closed to any American." So he taught a couple more years, he went into politics, but those experiences stayed with him. And when he became president, he called for an act of Congress to improve the education opportunities for underprivileged students. And the result of that was the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. It provided money for supplemental education material, but it had a provision. The subject matter had to be appropriate for urban school children. So in 1965, a year after the Civil Rights Act, that's the year that people of any color other than pink first appeared in the series. And it was in the form of an African-American family with a mother, a father, and the twin girls, Pam and Penny, and an older brother, Mike. Well, of course, there always had to be an older brother to help make those cardboard boxes into playhouses and put colored streamers in the spokes of your tricycle. Interestingly enough, Mike was, they were very, very careful. Mike was exactly the same age, the same size, the same temperament as Dick. And in fact, historians have pointed out in the Dick and Jane books that he was actually Dick's first friend. Pam and Penny and Mike's family, they had the same values, they had the same work ethic, they had the same material things. Their dad was a white-collar worker, and their mom was a housewife. Perhaps the only major difference lay in the fact that their grandparents lived in the city in an apartment, not the country, on a farm like Dick and Jane's parents. A lot of the Dick and Jane stories were going to visit grandmother and grandfather on the farm. The text designers clearly were careful in their demographic research, and Pam and Penny's family brought kind of a new sense of style and energy to the books and the street. And so, despite what was going on in the social upheaval in the outside world, in these sheltered pages, there was complete harmony. But there was a lot of outrage and complaints about this, that Scott Forsman made these changes, even though they were very, very almost timid in how they did it. At times they just, as I've looked through the books, they just darkened someone's face. You know, they could put in, if it was more than... Now this is just a very quick little... This is one of the Preprimers from 1965. Same words. Here we have before we read up into the 60s, 1962, and for they revised them early 1965 to add to make integrated versions, and you can see how that's just the cover, and they did that with the other books too, all of the books. This is an interesting example of one of the illustrations of what they did. You can see that that's the 1962. You can see the 1965. Everything stayed the same. They kind of pushed Mother over toward the shelves, and they put Mike and Penny's mom there, and then they kind of put so they didn't make all new illustrations. They just kind of switched things around a little bit. And here are the revisions from 62 to 65. Sally, Dick, and Jane now became, now we read the covers, and you can see how it changed in 1965. Now, because there were so many complaints in certain parts of the country about these changes, Scott Forsman tried to give everybody what they might want. Now, here's an example. The middle booklet, this is from the Fun Wherever We Are. The middle booklet is cut off. It's the only thing I can find. So they would offer the integrated cover on the right. They didn't. The content was still, the illustrations inside were still. They would offer the cover in the middle, and then they introduced, because they figured they couldn't offend anybody, they added what they called child art covers. They were kind of referred to as finger paint covers. So They were trying hard, I guess. Okay. Here's a little example you can see from the Friends We Know is actually Seventh-day Adventist, but it had a different kind of cover that could be purchased. You can also see what they did, for example, here's an illustration from 62 and 65. They just bumped Jane out and put Mike in. No. This just happens to be, there was a junior primer that was sometimes used before Fun with Dick and Jane. You can see again through the years, by 65, you could have your pickup covers. Just I've got the books up here, you can see the 62, and then the integrated covers with, and by 65 they were introducing some Asian American children. There was also the little girl in the pink, that was Rosa Cruz, so there was Hispanic. And the Seventh-day Adventist, by 1966, they had permission to publish it. They called it New Friends to Know and More Friends to Know, and with Jesus on the cover, with Dick, Jane, and Mike. So. There are some books, in fact I have them here, you could buy that cover, again, you could buy that cover with the first page like that, or schools could purchase the book with that on the outside cover and that on the inside cover. So. Well, as desegregation was enforced in the 60s, book publishers, they realized that they had to reflect future classrooms. But it was really too late for Dick and Jane. The 65 books were the last new editions of the series, and Scott Forsman moved on to publishing other materials that emphasized a multicultural world. Well, as the first stories read by American children, Dick and Jane presented that homogeneous world where night never came, knees never got scraped, parents never yelled, everything was fun. And then in the 50s, when television kind of took over the American landscape, shows like Ozzie and Harriet and Father Knows Best and the Donna Reed Show, they continued to promote this, what was really in many ways a fabricated scenario of the ideal well-behaved American family. Looking back from what I've read, this idealized Dick and Jane books must have been a welcome fantasy for school children who lived through the Great Depression and World War II.
Yeah.
And for many baby boomers who escaped the hardships of their parents and were born into a middle-class post-war era, the optimistic stories might have felt kind of close to their everyday experiences. But the familiar images do paint a telling picture of mid-century America, with all the persistent struggles to define and pursue and live out what is considered to be the American dream. Well, Dick and Jane's books reflected those ongoing shifts in Americans' evolving ideas of gender, race, modern technology, and fashion from the 30s through the 60s. There were so many significant changes in the series which tried to clearly reflect historical movements in the country, such as the growth of the feminist movement and the changing role of women. And then with the expanded versions of African American, Asian American, and other minorities, highlighted the civil rights movement and a growing awareness of the American cultural population. But by the late 1960s, Dick and Jane were all but gone. They weren't like what most kids who were reading about them were like, not even white middle-class kids. And but they were no means forgotten. The critics continued to attack them. They just wouldn't let them go in peace. So when phonics proponents squared off against whole word advocates in education, they used excerpts and pictures from Dick and Jane readers as bad examples. Multiculturalists pointed out the lack of minorities and the racial insensitivities of the Scott Forsman. Feminists spoke out against sex stereotypes in the basic readers. So retrospectively, Dick and Jane began to symbolize for many the inadequacies of the entire Cold War era. But anyway, Zerna Sharp going back to Zerna Sharp, the mother of Dick and Jane. She lived until 1981. She retired from Scarp Forsman in 1964, but she stayed on as a consultant in 1971. She was always proud of the books, and she was greatly offended by all the criticism when they came under attack. When she was asked in an interview about the denunciation of the whole word method in Rudolph Flesch's book, Why Johnny Can't Read, she tersely replied, quote, 50 million people did learn to read with our books, even if Johnny didn't. In response to criticism that the books were too simplistic and the poor children could not relate to the middle-class characters, Sharp once explained in an interview, quote, there's nothing these book children could do that actual children couldn't remember having done themselves. We made reading easy for them, and we encouraged them to read more. She was especially bothered by attacks from women's groups about Jane and Mother's stereotypical roles, feeling it was the adults who had the problem, not the children. I think it's ironic because to be attacked by feminists because Zerna Sharp was a strongly independent woman with a business career and innovative ideas, and it made her a woman ahead of her times who had been long working and successfully in a male-dominated publishing industry. So when Scott Forsman yielded to pressure and officially made the decision to kill the Dick and Jane characters, she was heartbroken. The last surviving authors, there were usually multiple authors of the Dick and Jane books, was Dr. A. Sterl Hartley. And he died in 1998. And he was internationally recognized as an authority on reading techniques. So into his later years, he went around and did lots of lectures and things like that. But he could never get away, with everything else he did, he couldn't get away from the legacy of Dick and Jane, because he was always asked, invariably, whatever happened to Dick and Jane? So he made up this little response that he would give when asked, whatever happened to Dick and Jane? And he would say, and tell his audiences, well, Dick became a politician. His slogan was, run, Dick, run. And then Jane married. She became an ardent advocate for women's rights, helped Jane win equal rights for women. And what about Sally? Well, Sally became a primary teacher with a room full of admiring children. And she frequently said to them, jump, children, jump. Jump high in the air. Well, anyway, Dick and Jane are still with us, believe it or not. And they remain with their sister Sally and Spot and Puff, virtually the only characters in the history of American primary education whose names have become household words.
Yeah.
Many Americans remember the duo fondly, and they collect copies of the books, if they're crazy like me, in which, I don't do that much, in which they appeared, and they're now considered collector's items. And as I said, some collectors are real particular, and they try to get, if I see something, take that or pretty much stop collecting at this point. Well, they're so iconic that in 2003, Grosset and Dunlap re-released the original Dick and Jane primers, and you could buy them at Walmart and everything. The publisher added a disclaimer. He noted that the books are nostalgic and they're not intended to be used to teach children to read. Well, they sold 2.5 million copies of the reissue, and it generated merchandise in the form of mugs and refrigerator magnets and t-shirts and carry-all bags. And they've all been produced with the iconic imagery and the catchphrases like see Spot run. So in conclusion, I guess everyone has a different opinion about the past. And such opinions sometimes stoke political movements. Some say the suburbs were perfect for children. Some say the suburbs were alienating. The 50s were repressed. The 50s were heaven. The 60s destroyed everything. The 60s freed us. So history in that way can be a problem. But nostalgia is private and malleable. It's different. It's as simple as a Dick and Jane story. Dick and Jane stir memories that may have lingered for decades because they remind us of our own histories. They take us back to a time of the innocence of childhood that people really like to feel. And just once in a while, I think it's a lot of fun to go back to childhood memories and feel nostalgic about the predictable and trouble-free world of Dick and Jane.